Hi, my name's Sheehan, and today I'd like to talk about Henry VIII, The Quest for Fame by John Guy. And I'd just like to go through this slim volume, just really describing what each of the chapters are about, and then just giving my thoughts on it. Now, this is part of the Penguin Monarchs Series, a really handsome collection of books spanning the lives of every one of the English monarchs, from Saxon times all the way up to Queen Elizabeth II. And they're really beautiful books, you know, hardback with these lovely dust jackets with great pictures of the kings and queens on the front. This one's by Peter Blake, I presume the Peter Blake who did the cover to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But yeah, they're great. They're just really lovely books, and I've got a few of them, and I just reread this one recently. Now, John Guy is a top Tudor scholar, and I know his name because I remember studying A-level history and doing the Tudors, and there's this big thick tome by John Guy we had to plough through. But yeah, you know, this is written in a really engaging way, and according to the introduction, Guy really wants to delve into the mind of Henry VIII. This book really tries to unpick what motivated Henry VIII, his psychological makeup, the people who and events which perhaps made him think the way he did, and think of himself the way he did. And it's worth noting, you know, that the subtitle of this book, The Quest for Fame, you've always got that in the back of your mind, that Henry, perhaps above all else, wanted to make a name for himself and to be the greatest monarch of them all. The book's in 6 chapters, and the first chapter is really about Henry's formative years, from his birth in 1491 until his coronation after the death of his father, Henry VII. And, you know, Guy paints a picture of a supremely confident, precocious child, very intelligent, with a fantastic education. You know, he kind of encounters Erasmus at one point, who is stunned by the boy's intelligence, but also rather embarrassed by the fact that he didn't write some poetry for him, and he's had to spend all night trying to get these lines of verse together. I found that quite an amusing story. But also times were quite unsettled for Henry as well. That, you know, there was still rumours of plots for those who didn't recognise his father as the rightful king. At one point, Henry Jr. had to be rushed to the Tower of London, surrounded by soldiers. But his mother is the biggest influence on him, and Guy writes about how much he loved his mother and doted upon her, and how grief-stricken he was when she died. Now, of course, Henry wasn't supposed to be in line to be king. His brother was, Arthur, his older brother. But Arthur died as well, and Henry didn't really know Arthur, but Henry's life changed forever, of course, and with the death of his father, Henry was crowned king, and he married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, which of course has huge implications a bit further on into his reign and for English history generally. So at the end of this chapter, Henry executes Empson and Dudley, 2 nobles who did his father's kind of dirty work in kind of creating a climate of fear, suspicion, and, you know, kind of blackmailing people, fining people, etc. And Henry seems to execute them on trumped up charges, and despite the fact that 2 unpopular people, John Guy suggests this is a sign of things to come. When Henry decides he's against someone, that's it. Now, chapter 2 is all about Henry's changing attitude to the Pope. Henry begins this chapter as the glorious, handsome, charismatic young king who goes over to France in these impressive yet ultimately inconsequential battles. The king who meets Francis on the field of cloth of gold. The king who is advised by Cardinal Wolsey. The king who is a staunch defender of Catholicism and the Pope's right-hand man. Indeed, he is given the name Defender of the Faith, a name he coveted. This is the Henry who writes against Martin Luther and the Reformation. But how things change, of course, and with Henry's impatience of Catherine of Aragon giving birth to a male heir, and then him falling in love with Anne Boleyn, the Pope's reluctance to declare his first marriage invalid. This all causes Henry to shift in his attitude to the Pope. In chapter 3, John Guy spells out Henry's vision of being some kind of spiritual head of his own church in his land. This is a vision Henry seemed to come up with the help of his with scholars such as Edward Fox and theologians such as Thomas Cranmer, and he seems to run with this vision. But of course it's all simply spurred on by his frustration about not getting a divorce. It's in this chapter that the Act of Supremacy comes into play in 1534, where Henry declares himself head of the church, and everyone has to take an oath. And of course, people of principle such as Thomas More, John Fisher, the Carthusian monks, all are executed because of their refusal to take these oaths. The monks in particular, who die in a terrible way. It seems the bloodshed and the fear is growing amongst those around Henry and in the population at large. And it's here we're reminded of the downfall of Cardinal Wolsey and the rise of Thomas Cromwell, but then Henry's impatience with Anne Boleyn and her execution, and then Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour. At the end of chapter 3, John Guy remarks that the Pope was about to offer an olive branch to Henry to patch things up between them. But as the next chapter shows, chapter 4, that's not the case. Henry's attitude hardens. And it's in this chapter that the dissolution of the monasteries really gathers apace. It's here that Henry puts down the pilgrimage of grace in the north. But ultimately, Henry sees himself as the arbiter of Christendom, as John Guy puts it, the kind of main man of European politics and spiritual matters, which of course he wasn't really, but he thought himself that way. Henry makes overtures to the Schmalkaldic League, this group of Protestant princes, and also trying to kind of be a mediator with the Catholic nations as well. And of course Henry's theology is somewhere between the two. Guy writes he's stranded between the Tiber and Wittenberg, which is perhaps a good description of Anglicanism generally, even to this day. But ultimately, despite the marriage to Anne of Cleves, etc., Henry really is an irrelevance as far as most of the other leaders are concerned. They view him in a somewhat kind of patronising way. He really isn't a key player in the league of, say, Charles V or Francis I or the Pope. It's in this chapter, of course, that Thomas Cromwell falls out of favour and is executed. Chapter 5 is about Henry's artistic and material extravagances. You know, his buildings, his palaces, the art he confiscated off the monasteries, his fine clothes. And perhaps most interestingly, John Guy writes about the genius of Hans Holbein, who painted portraits of much of the court, including Henry. This is the really famous image here, of course. And he says, Hans Holbein really paints in such a way that he gets something of the psychology of the sitter as well, which perhaps the sitter wasn't aware of at the time. Holbein having the last laugh, if you like. The final chapter is about the ailing Henry. Henry, by this point, had got so fat and so unhealthy, he had to be moved around on these kind of seats around Whitehall Palace. By this point, of course, he's with Catherine Parr. She has a narrow escape. She almost gets herself in a lot of trouble, but manages to smooth things over with him. And then really it's about the power struggle between a group of nobles about who will be Edward's protectors when King Edward becomes king after Henry's death. And it's the Earl of Hertford and William Paget who manage to gain the ascendancy in this, and they indeed do become the protectors of Edward VI. And then John Guy finishes with a brief evaluation of Henry's reign. Now, if you just want a quick but dense read, going through the important facts of Henry's reign, and then really getting an insight into his character as well, then this is the book to get. It's really, really excellent. It really brings to mind how deluded Henry was, that in his vanity, in his pride, he just continually felt that he was the be-all and end-all, which I suppose is an obvious thing to say about a medieval king, but he really saw himself not only as the be-all and end-all in the temporal sense, but also in the spiritual sense, which of course was all motivated really by his frustration about not having a male heir. So it's a really excellent book, and Henry comes across as a frightening, dangerous and intimidating character, but also with this rather cowardly streak almost. This is really interesting. He apparently, when he decided he was going to ruin somebody, when he didn't want anyone around anymore, he couldn't look them in the eye and he avoided them, and that includes his wives as well. There's something rather pathetic about that, despite his bluster. But the very last sentence I think is very good. Guy writes, "For all his self-contradictions, Henry VIII was still the most remarkable ruler ever to sit on the English throne." And, who can argue with that? He is surely the most recognisable and most familiar English monarch, and I suspect one of the most famous rulers ever, globally as well. So yeah, check this book out, and if you see any of the other titles in bookshops or whatever, get those, because they're really beautiful little books. Thanks for watching. Bye.